So thank you, Dipanshu. Thank you to Madhav and Sahil who invited and Srijit and Amritansh today. And it's a pleasure to be in the company of Professor Ajay Gudavarthy and Madhumita. So, and the questions are very good. So we were asked to focus on any one mainly, and I will focus on question number 2. And please understand that I'm a literature teacher, but for some reason today I'll try to be also an economist. So if I get it wrong, please don't mind it. So let's sort of get back to this entire idea of what is this minority and majority business at all. And minority rights as a matter of law, as a matter of international law, are a more recent phenomena. And it's only after the First World War, during the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, that for the first time the issue of German and Polish rights became a point of dispute, where Polish rights were there in Germany, not protected, and German minorities in Poland were protected. So it became a point of contention. So there was, in 1919, a treaty signed, but in fact the entire treaty, peace treaty, was ignored because progressively the world moved into the Second World War. And we know that the Second World War involved the Holocaust, involved very massive violence against Jews as a minority, and the concept of minority rights as a benchmark of good, robust democracies. That do democracies really preserve the rights of minority to sustain, to live with dignity, safety, security? That became a big issue after the Second World War. So it came into the UN Charter post the Second World War, and since then there have been progressively several kinds of notions of minority rights slowly incorporated both in international law and domestic laws of various countries. Today we know that minority is a complex term, so arguments of LGBTQ rights are made in terms of sexual minorities. So traditional conceptions of minority, just in terms of religion, race, language, region, have also vastly expanded over the last several decades, both in law as well as in politics and mobilization and activity, questions of identity, as you were mentioning, etc. Of course, in the decolonizing nations post the Second World War, India's independence and the fact that India had a partition, and at the heart of the debate of partition was the question of whether minorities will have rights, or the question that minorities will not have rights for sure, hence another nation altogether. So that impacted in a very big way, because India was among the first few countries to actually decolonize, and the fact that India chose not to be a Hindu Rashtra and chose to have a constitution that incorporated very soon, by 1949 itself, Article 15, which said no discrimination on the basis of race, language, religion, region, and also Articles 29-30, which sort of said that minorities, linguistic and religious, will have right to preserve their culture and run their educational institutions for that purpose. Now, of course, minority has a complex history. The chief architect of our constitution, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, used the term minority for a long time to argue for what are now called Dalit rights. So he used the term minority rights for that for a very, very, very long time. So minority rights being enshrined in the Indian constitution also had its own effect on other decolonizing nations. So two things happened simultaneously: the post-Holocaust Second World War and India's independence in 1947, the debate around minority rights right there and then, and its impact, unfolding impact on other decolonizing struggles. Today, by contrast, and it's been quite some time since then, we are witnessing generally a wave of what is being called by many populism, by many muscular majoritarianism sweeping around the world. Now, we have a lot of instances where one can talk about it. For instance, in China, the Han are 99, almost 97 to 98% majority. The Muslims are like 1% in the Uyghur region. And yet there is a even more stronger majority assertion that the minority has to just assimilate and, not be like an autonomous independent minority. We know about the case of the Rohingyas in Myanmar. We know about the Tamil minorities in Sri Lanka. We know about minorities in Muslim nations, both other religious minorities as well as the Shia Sunni. The moment the dynamics of minority majority changes, there's a lot of majoritarian assertion there. In India, we have the beginnings of, or not just the beginnings, but quite a bit of majoritarian assertion. And we are certainly, if time permits, we'll discuss a little bit staring at the specter of the NRC. But the Citizenship Amendment Bill, that is the proposed bill which has been promised that it will be passed in the next session of Parliament, is openly proclaiming that except Muslims, everybody else who's persecuted in other countries, neighboring countries, will be admitted as citizens of India. So it's sort of just overturning Article 15, which said we will not discriminate on the basis of race, religion, caste, region. But the Citizenship Amendment Bill, there's open proclamations, there's no apology about it. By now, open public speeches are being made about it, that except Muslims, everyone else will be granted citizenship. So it's a very interesting turn that we are seeing. And we are seeing in European nations a distinctly white supremacist assertion as well, which, given the backdrop since 9/11 of the clash of civilizations paradigm, has Islamophobia and aspects of religion enmeshed in it as well. And yet the most interesting part of today's juncture is what is being discussed by a lot of scholars, especially in the US, which is about the victimology of the dominant. That a new psyche that is sort of gaining ground is that dominant groups are feeling victimized by various minorities or various oppressed groups. They are convinced about it. People are completely convinced about it. So in the backdrop of, say, Me Too, we have men saying, they're feminists, women, they're victimizing us. We have, of course, upper caste assertions saying that every time caste is being raised, that is vitiating the question of, that is vitiating society. The question of race, whenever African Americans are saying white supremacy, they are being racist. Why are they talking about race instead? So there are very interesting, what in logic are called false equivalences, that are being used today, even in the culture of whataboutery, but very distinct notions of victimology of the dominant, which is troubling. But since we started with the First and the Second World War, some people who are analyzing the current trends as a trajectory towards proto-fascism today, that perhaps the world is moving in that direction. Proto means towards, sort of, not there quite yet. Let's see how the trajectory of the world goes, but they are drawing parallels with what was happening in the fascist ideology and politics itself during the Second World War, which was the idea of racial supremacy based on a reinvention of Darwin's survival of the fittest theory. Just the simple theory that yes, it is a conflict and it is a battle of the survival of the fittest, and the fittest will survive. The weak have to just perish, and it's just natural order. So the apology about violence sort of went out of that entire logic, this mass violence. There's no apology about it, but rather there was a justification about it, that it's the survival of the fittest. And we know that even today in our general political discourse, we see a very growing disdain towards those who claim to be weak, those who claim to be poor, those who want special measures. There's a disdain and almost a sort of dislike, derision, if people are sort of making that claim, coming in. So everybody should be strong, And it's an interesting paradox that while that supremacist trends are there, there's also the sense of victimhood. And it's a reverse victimhood. Now, of course, these trends are happening at a time when there's a very interesting anti-globalization turn that many people are talking about. And it's a turn that people are talking about since 2016, when major political manifestations started with Brexit, with the election of Donald Trump, who were both both political developments were very explicit about being anti-globalization. And since then, of course, even major corporate forums like the World Economic Forum, etc., have begun to acknowledge that some things need to change in globalization. Perhaps the income inequality has become too much. And I would just like to share some quick figures, because they're coming not from academic schools, but sort of mainstream neoliberal institutions also. They're also endorsing it. So there's a sort of acknowledgement that something has gone wrong with globalization. So today we are living in a world where the world's 26 richest individuals have as much wealth as the poorest 50%. We are also living in India, where the top 1% owns or gets, or at least last year, got 73% of all the country's wealth generated over last year. And the richest 1% in India, their wealth grew in 1 year by 39%. And the poorest 50%, their wealth, that is about 67 crore citizens, their wealth grew by about 1%. So people are alarmed. All kinds of institutions are alarmed that there is this very widening income inequality around the world. And what's interesting is that this anti-globalization turn is also marked by a general slowdown in economy. And I will suggest Nikhil Sawal's Globalization and the Rise and Fall of an Idea that swept the world, which appeared in The Guardian as an accessible article that perhaps students here can read to see what twists and turns have come, because for about 50 years of globalization, since 1970s, about 40 odd years, the world grew at the rate of 7%. But since the economic crisis, 2008, and earlier this decade, the overall growth rate is down. It's just about 3%. And over the last 5-6 years, there's more cause for alarm, because although the theory that every place will grow actually never happened, yet there were booms in some parts. So there's a Latin American boom that goes bust, then there's a Southeast Asian boom that goes bust, then there's the India-China boom that is, there's a slowdown there. Right now we're in a situation where there's no part of the world that is seeing remarkable growth at all. There's just an overall slowdown. And the other theory of globalization, which was that, okay, fine, in the first world, yes, employment may go to other cheaper labor, other places, other markets. Investment may go elsewhere, but it's a win-win situation, because if things are going and people are sort of, if things are going slow and people are sort of losing money here in terms of wages and work and employment, somewhere else people will get employment and wages, and the goods may be cheaper. So if some money is being lost, at least they will be getting all kinds of things cheaper. So it's a win-win cycle. That's the theory of globalization in terms of how it's a viable and a good economic system. But over time, by now, it is more and more people are remarking on it, that by now it's failing, it's not working out. People in the advanced capitalist countries are also losing wages. They are losing wages and seeing a depression in employment, because work is going elsewhere. But elsewhere, it's not a boom in wages or employment, because there's a race to the bottom. Because if something is happening in India, 2 years, 3 years down the line, if Indian workers are asking for more wages, the business will go to Philippines. So there is always a race to the bottom that's happening. So actually, it has led to an overall depression of wages that has been recorded around the world that is becoming problematic, and an overall unemployment that is also becoming problematic. Now, there are many who are talking about the specter of unemployment in terms of, the artificial intelligence, robotics, and automation. Even in the recent, Gurgaon story, where there was a lot of talk of auto industries, not producing, slow down, closing down for several days. Part of the job loss, which appeared as major news item, was because of the slowdown, but part of the job loss was also because of the transition to automation. automation. Now, there are many, say, for instance, in Oxford University, there was a study in 2013 that started this debate in a big way, that as much as 47% of the US jobs are at risk within the next 10 years. By now, there are many, many, many debates that are seeing that we are also staring at a possibility that many people just might be unemployable. You know, now, of course, in India, we have those employability reports, which even the HRD ministry brings. So India had the engineering and the technology, the IT boom, but by now the reports are 85% of engineers are unemployable. They're sort of outdated already in terms of the skills they have. They can't be employed by the IT sector. So there is that specter also. And if there is any truth to it, then there is a three-way situation that we are looking at. At one side is, say, Donald Trump or the Brexiteers or politics or political manifestations of that kind that represent the backlash to globalization, but they represent the backlash to globalization of labor, sorry, not capital, the globalization of labor, hence the anti-immigrant, the anger at, all the other labor, all the other immigrants who are coming in, so racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, all kinds of anger manifesting itself against immigrants, but it's about against globalization of labor, that labor should not be globally mobile. But there is not too much of a problem in terms of globalization of capital. If at all, there are problems with free trade, but not with free market. Another pole is the neoliberal pole, which is okay with globalization of capital as well as okay with globalization of labor. And then there's a third pole, which is okay with globalization of labor, okay with migrants, but absolutely anti-globalization of capital and saying it's the 1% versus the 99%. So we have a politics emerging, which is like a three-way politics, which has sort of overlaps with each other, So the neoliberals are overlapping with the right in terms of being okay with capital being globalized. The right is sort of having overlaps with the left in terms of the anti-globalization sentiment. The left is having overlaps with the neoliberals in terms of being okay with globalization of labor, immigration, but not okay with globalization of capital. It's a very interesting scenario. And each has a solution for it. Now, the left is saying the 1% has to be restructured. This entire system has to be restructured, which is allowing this concentration of capital, this depression of wages, this massive unemployment, and the specter of AI robotics, which may make people unemployable as well. So it's talking about the fundamental restructuring and moving away from both free trade and free market economy. Also has protectionist sort of things, but it's asking for economic justice. The neoliberals are saying that yes, the system, they're on the defensive world over, and they're saying, yes, something needs to change, and the universal basic income or things like that are the remedy, that people who will be unemployed perhaps need some basic income. And the right also has a remedy, which is genocide, which is that, get rid of the people. And why I'm saying it as crudely as that is, can you just play that video? I just want to refer to a popular film that you have, that's popular with your generation, which is the Avengers Infinity War, which after 23 movies sort of culminated in the 24th, in the battle of all the superheroes against Thanos. And Thanos has a solution to the world's problems. So let's just quickly hear him. I'm sorry, I'm overshooting the time.
Face to face with the master of mystic arts. Where do you think you are? Let me guess. Your home? It was. And it was beautiful. like those planets. Too many mouths not enough to go around. And when we faced extinction, I offered a solution. Genocide.
Yeah, so let's just pause it there, because his solution is that, there's a lot of drain on resources, they're useless people. His justice lies in the idea that from the rich to the poor, 1/3 should just be killed. There should be a genocide with the 6 infinity stones. But the surprising thing is that not everybody thinks Thanos is the villain. And we are living in a world where, despite Thanos having a genocidal agenda, there are websites. So one is Thanos did nothing wrong, became a popular trend. And there are people, big communities that say, look, no, whatever. He recognizes the problem, right? Yeah, his solution may not have worked. This one may, because he tries to do 2 genocides, one by 1/3, uniformly from rich to poor. That would be economic justice. The second time he says, oh, but if you leave people behind, then they remember, and they have memories of violence and loss. So the next genocide he wants is to kill everybody. So, but people support him. And I just want to go back to the last slide, which is before one, the first one, which is a satirical essay by Jonathan Swift that appeared in 1729, which was a modest proposal, which was that Irish children could be fed, of poor Irish people could just be fed as food to the richer English people, and that would solve so many problems. Now, it sounds so outrageous, but when this satirical pamphlet appeared, it's a very famous satirical pamphlet, A Modest Proposal. Surprise, surprise, many people took it seriously as an economic remedy of the problems that were there. So, it's in the cultural domain that I am, as a literature professor, more alarmed that there are, very supporting and very torn conflicts over Thanos can be good. Yeah, he's actually the hero. So it troubles me. So yeah, we are not right there, but yeah, we are moving there. Yeah, thank you.
It was brilliant. Thank you so much, ma'am. I think this is very, very, very in line. Can we have Professor Ajay moving in now, and then Professor Madhumita?
Okay, so let me thank the Economics Society. I think it's good to see economists moving to political psychology. It's part of the behavioral revolution that we are back to. And I think it's much needed. And I think JNU economics need to do some catch-up now, because many of them don't discuss these categories. But it's particularly instructive to see that why economists should be raising this question of political psychology, public morality, and question of violence. I think it's at the heart of economic changes that we are witnessing. Albeena has already touched upon a relatively global scale. Let me get into the Indian case that, the current context of cultural majoritarianism in India, what could be the possible explanation of the conjuncture today? I think we need to find answers for this, because we have had this kind of extreme right-wing politics. Even if you take RSS, goes back to almost 100 years. But why is it that this agenda caught up popular imagination in the last decade or so? And I think there can be multiple possibly complex explanations, and we need to do some conjecturing, some intuitive reasoning. And I've been arguing for quite some time now that traditional protocols of social science don't actually help us. They actually burden us now in terms of providing viable and good answers to the kind of thing that we are witnessing. It is a kind of a post-rational scenario that we are witnessing, and the social science protocols and methodologies actually don't help us much. If you look at the current context, it's clearly that the right-wing cultural majoritarianism caught up after the neoliberal reforms. And this neoliberal reforms is doing something in terms of an emergent political subjectivity in India, which is running counter to what one would ideally expect in terms of a traditional conventional analysis, that growing inequalities should have actually led to more protest politics, more anti-corporate politics. There should actually be a rise of left-wing kind of politics, but that's not what we are witnessing across the globe, not just in India. So there is some specificity to this neoliberalism. I think a generic critique of neoliberalism would not help us. And in Indian context, if one way to look at, if you look at the multi-level development poverty index that was recently released, it claimed that more than 271 million have been pushed out of abject poverty. So even as inequalities are growing on a massive scale, absolute inequalities are growing, there is some relative mobility at the bottom of the pyramid. And we need to theorize this. What does this relative mobility from abject poverty to vulnerability? I think there is a very tenuous, vulnerable inclusion that is happening at the bottom of the pyramid. One of the recent IMF reports argued in the Indian context that intergenerational mobility is fastest among the backward castes, other backward castes, OBCs rather than the upper castes, which is moving them from the rural to the peri-urban and those in the peri-urban to the urban metros, which is what we generally studied simply as a phenomenon of migration. But more than migrant, there is a caste dimension to that migration. If you take just these two statistical realities, what does it do to the political subjectivity? That, in other words, there is a kind of an expectation, there's a kind of an aspirational mood that has been developed post-neoliberalism, even as absolute inequalities are going. But abject people are being pushed out of abject poverty into in terms of one kind of vulnerability. Good guy standing calls it a precariat kind of a situation. The other important aspect of Indian history one looks at last three, the unmistakable contribution of the Dalit Bahujan politics. I think one has to also get into therefore the details of what is happening to caste question, along with the kind of political economy frame that Albeena has offered, which I think is spot on. This aspect of what you call the reverse vulnerability, there's a reverse victimology. I call it in my own writings as a sense of herd pride that the dominant castes are today facing. Also has something to do with in terms of getting into the caste psyche. And the very nature of caste, I think we need to now completely redo our study of understanding caste. It is a ladder-like structure. I think the old post-colonial frame of subaltern elite does not work. I think I and Swagato keep discussing this aspect. Simply, I think who is a subaltern, I think is a question in Indian politics. So as who is an elite. There are no elite and autonomous domains that are readily available. And I think Dalit Bahujan mobilization of last 5 decades has really helped in terms of breaking the old patron-client relations. So we have this multiple conjuncturing that is happening where neoliberalism has opened up some kind of an aspirational mood. Then you have the Dalit Bahujan politics, which is breaking the old patronage, which is more in terms of a kind of a psychological empowerment rather than material opportunities. So we have this kind of a dissonance that has happened between your aspirational imagination of where you ought to be and where you are. And I think Wendy Brown points it out in her book on repressive tolerance that today democracies across globe are facing this crisis, that the discourse of democratization has reached the last man. Everybody today has an imagination of what he or she ought to be, whether it's a question of gender, whether it's sexual minorities, whether it is untouchables, Dalits, women, you name it. Every community today has an imagination of what the democratic aspiration should be. This sense of, Laclau and Moove point out in their book that this sense of spirit of democracy flows laterally to all communities. But obviously, global capitalism, neoliberal structures, state laws do not allow that to fructify. So there is this continuous hiatus, a humongous hiatus between our... So democracy has allowed us to imagine. To that extent, I think it is democratic. But in terms of its material arrangement, obviously, and therefore you find, Cas Mede gives a very interesting, a Dutch scholar makes a very interesting proposition that what you had in last 4 decades, he says, is undemocratic liberalism. And what you are having today is a backlash, and he calls it democratic illiberalism. So this is the contrast we are really struck by, that you had this liberalism which was constitutional, which spoke a procedural language, which spoke a question of individual rights, civil liberties, rule of law, and all of that, representation. But this liberalism did not get manifest in the popular consent. It did not have that mass narrative. I think post-colonial scholars in India partly pointed out to that. And what we're witnessing today, what we're referring otherwise as cultural majoritarianism, is a backlash to this kind of an old liberalism. And we need to really ask this question as to why what we thought that this relation between liberalism and democracy would actually reinforce each other, but liberalism over a period has actually undermined democracies. And therefore, what we today have is populism is one kind of a democratic assertion. Even a right-wing populism, I would argue, has a kind of a mass narrative. And therefore, the cultural idiom that they are using, the popular appeal that they have, the symbols that they use, the appeal to public morality, popular psychology, everyday ethics, I think these are hugely democratizing effects. But obviously, the way they are structuring them is extremely illiberal. So I think this is a new kind of a challenge. The old kind of a challenge was the difference between liberalism and the tension between liberalism and democracy. Today what you have is a bottom-up democratization, which is essentially very illiberal in spirit. So this is absolutely a new kind of challenge, and therefore we witness street violence, mob lynching. This whole muscular majoritarianism has this inherent element within it. And therefore, as Albeena also already pointed out, that I think this kind of a muscular bottom-up mobilization, I think, is extremely difficult to theorize today. One cannot simply dismiss it as muscular majoritarianism. That there is a strong element of anti-elitist mobilization in terms of its cultural idiom, in terms of the language that it is using, in terms of mass appeal, in terms of the way it's shifting the liberal old distinctions between private and public, in terms of the way it's exposing the limitations of secular discourse, which was highly in terms of liberal, metropolitan kind of a discourse. So to that extent, I see a process of democratization. I would call it, drawing parallel with what Rob Jenkins said, it is economic reforms by stealth. This is democratization by stealth. They're actually knocking at and highlighting the limitations of what liberalism is. But that nature of democratization that we are witnessing has this inherently very core illiberal character to itself. That is highly illiberal in terms of its majoritarian, muscular, masculine character. How are these coexisting together? Is this illiberalism part of the popular imagination that already existed, or is it being constructed? Even to address this question, I think it's extremely complex. We simply cannot afford straight answers or very linear kind of theorization. This has, as I said, something to do, in Indian case, I think it has something to do with this caste structure. That the fact that it's a ladder-like, the caste is like a ladder-like structure, and anti-caste movements, if one observes historically, have been anti those who were hegemonic, but they did not mobilize for those who were below them. That they questioned power of those who were above them, but never had enough sufficient compassion for those who were below them. I think for the first time you're having a breakdown of this larger grids called Dalit and OBCs, and power is flowing to smaller sections and subcastes within these larger grids. And to that extent, I think patron-client relations are being questioned, but any form of solidarity, any kind of collective, is today being construed as either hegemonic or as loss of power. And part of the reason why left is facing this kind of a terminal crisis is because left fundamentally relies on its mobilization strategy in terms of generating major, big collectives. It could be around class or... But what has happened with the breakdown of patron-client relations within the caste system is that any form of collective, any form of solidarity is being construed by caste as loss of power and a kind of a reinforcement of dominant old kind of hegemony. Therefore, this whole language, anti-elitist language, one can go into details, but I don't have the time, that this, how right is being able to pitch their narrative as part of this changing social reality. Therefore, every kind of an old language of secularism, class, politics, institutions, rule of law, constitution, it all in popular imagination depicts the old kind of patronage system. And the classical example is the idea of appeasement. I think if you understand this appeasement, what does this appeasement mean and why it has been pegged and signified in terms of the Muslim as that universal figure, you will imagine that all that belongs, therefore it's links to dynasty politics, Congress, 70 years, all that narrative one can see a kind of a link there. So it is coming through this process of breakdown of patron-client relation, which is democratization, but it leads to a majoritarianism. I think we are caught in that kind of a very strange kind of a transition, which needs much deeper explanation as to what could be the possible reason that 40 years of democratization in India actually leads to us towards a growing consent for a very majoritarian, regressive kind of politics, which are at one level anti-elitist, but in terms of the social content of that anti-elitism is highly regressive, whether it's a question of gender, whether it's caste or religion. This in itself, as I said, needs fairly complex explanations as to what could be the plausible reasoning. And much, as I argue, that it is a fit between the changes that neoliberalism brought about for the last 4 decades and the change in caste hierarchies. I think both these, if one takes even these two as a sort of a entry point, that would possibly give us some clues as to why this should be the way it is, that democratization itself leads to a kind of a surging majoritarianism. And as I said, that this caste, again, has one way to study. Now, as I said, that we need to redo this caste studies. Sociologists have to really rethink in terms of, and one of the entry points could be that instead of exclusively focusing on inter-caste relations, I think we have to now start thinking in terms of intra-caste relations. That what is happening to caste from within? That we have always studied relation between dominant, OBC, Dalit versus OBC, so on and so forth. But I think there is something more important happening to caste from within. And that is a sense of, I call it the dystopia of betrayal. That if you read the narratives of early Hindu nationalists, like Savarkar and Golwalkar, you sense a sense of paranoia. And that paranoia comes with this idea of internal enemy, a sense of strong betrayal, and all that, of course, got fixated on the idea of the Muslim and the Christian and those coming from outsiders. But I don't think, since we're talking political psychology, there is a residual story to that. And that paranoia was in terms of assertion of the lower caste. That there was a deep sense of betrayal, and that got expressed in terms of this lack of Hindu unity. If you read Savarkar, he's almost embarrassed to see the kind of diversity that Hinduism has. He's almost very, very embarrassed that Hinduism is such a religion which is so odd, unlike Islam, which is so organized, which is so unified, which is organized. And he feels that Hinduism is like in shambles. It's in all kinds of diverse practices, contradictory practices. And part of that anxiety comes, that lack of Hindu unity comes from this bottom-up mobilization. My own hunch, intuitively, if one were to reason, is that sense of betrayal that the Hindu nationalists felt in 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, today is being felt by every single caste. There is a kind of a conjuncturing one can read in terms of that sense of betrayal that existed within the Hindu nationalist movement and today's anti-caste movement. That every dominant caste today, in fact, every subcaste today, if one were to do ethnographic studies, feel that the castes below them have betrayed their sense of being. Because identity is always relational. Identity always needs two poles. You define yourself vis-a-vis something else. And I see a conjuncture between the old sense in which there was a betrayal of the Hindu nationalists and the kind of a generic sense of betrayal. And that partly, to me, explains the sense of anxiety that social groups are suffering today. The loss of sense of self, that you really do not know where you are located within the social ladder. And this loss of sense of self partly explains the consent for mass violence. That we are undergoing some kind of a confused subjectivity. Earlier theorists would call it double consciousness and things of that kind. But today I think we are witnessing in India this, and therefore there's a tremendous sense of self-hatred, there's a sense of self-denial, there's a sense of loss of dignity. And all of this is leading, therefore, not to a kind of a shared ethos. Because for an element like conscience or shame, if you read critical theory, somebody like Axel Honneth or Andrew Sayers, they would argue that shame is a powerful sentiment in any society because shame needs shared values. I and you value the same. When I don't stand up to the same value, then I suffer from a sense of guilt and a sense of shame. But we are undergoing a very strange kind of situation where we do not have shared values because of caste. And that partly explains why there is no mass guilt or conscience towards mass mob lynching. And I call it outsourcing of guilt. People actually feel a sense of gratitude to a figure like Godse. That he has done something that you silently wish, but you could not do it. I'll conclude by narrating an incident when I was in Auschwitz. When I went to visit the concentration camp, for a long time I was trying to understand that Nazis killing Jews is partly understandable. But Nazis just did not kill only Jews. They killed Germans, they killed whites, white communists, they killed even disabled white children. And it always struck me that how did German society consent to this? Othering Jews is possibly one can understand, like in Indian context today, you can understand how a narrative of the Muslim has been built. But how does one society consent to this? And there happens to be a museum and a research institute attached to Auschwitz, and there was a young PhD scholar, like all of you who has been researching and part of, who is a curator at the museum. I began chatting with him, and I raised this question, that this is a question that has been troubling me. I don't understand this for a long time. And he gave an interesting, he said that when Nazis came and picked up disabled children, his own research shows that the parents felt a sense of gratitude to those guys. Because they have actually relieved them from the burden of guilt of what they would have otherwise would have wanted to do with those children who were autistic and disabled, because it's like a lifelong suffering to look after them. But you can't do anything being a parent. Nazis actually, in picking up those kids and putting them into concentration camps, led to a silent sense of relief. And there was actually a silent consent, he says, to what they did. I think that this was a deep psychological revelation for me, how human psyche can work at odds and does not really, manifest what is visible on the plane. I think we'll have to look for these kinds of deep conjunctural links to really understand why today there's the kind of deafening silence to mob lynching. You see those very gory pictures of Muslims being beaten up, bleeding day in and day on television screens. People might not openly consent, but there is a silent outsourcing of guilt. And I think those are the questions that one need to really pick and answer as to what can one do in terms of reworking the political psychology in terms of those deeper points. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Dr. Das, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dipanshu. Thank you, students, and also my fellow panelists who have done most of the work of beautifully laying out the conceptual framework of most of the things that I would have said, and thus I can safely engage in polemics and hyperbole, right? But in the time that I have, I would actually like to take the chance to talk about two things. Of course, first of all, the first phenomena, we can peg it on the word lynching. That is, the other day Albeena and I were discussing, it is cannot be ignored. So even if it has been spoken by two people, it must be spoken of by the third. Lynching and everything around it, and how we got to here and what now. The other thing that being and having my training in IR and having my training in how states operate and knowing a little bit about insurgencies in the peripheral parts of India, and also the second part would peg on the phrase, the Naga national movement. I would use it again as a linchpin to actually, sir, take exception with some of the ideas that you raised. You know, you spoke about illiberal democratization, and earlier we had liberalism without democracy. So I would actually use the example of the state's recourse to violence in the process of building itself in order to question this absolute cohesion between liberalism and everything positive, everything humane, everything that is outside of the realm of violence, so to say. So these are the two things I'll try to do. Of course, I'm thankful to the panel because of the questions that you have put actually got me thinking about violence in a larger, more abstract sense, you know, its relationship with power, authority, legitimacy, justice, the law. I read up a little bit of Walter Benjamin and how he speaks about the law-making and law-preserving prerogatives of the state. And of course, Max Weber, who talks about what is the state. It's essentially that entity that can ensure a monopoly of violence over a given territory and then rule it as it sees fit, right? Now, the state's monopoly over violence is justified, it would seem, and it has been told to us, only if this power is used to ensure that no persons or group can exercise violence with impunity upon other persons or other groups, right? This, of course, presupposes that the constitutional promises of equality before the law for all citizens is imbibed by the state in not just letter, but also in spirit, right? In the Indian context, however, as B.R. Ambedkar was quick to point out, soon after the constitution was adopted, we would enter a period of formal equality with the granting of universal suffrage, but in economic and thus social life, we would be a society of fundamental inequality. Now, of course, the immediacy of things that is happening around us forces me to spend the first half of my deliberations on these delicate negotiations between groups, classes, the state, on the exercise of violence, and not just the political, but also the historical and the economic reasons for the state of affairs. The word, of course, is lynching. Professor Gudavarthy has pointed out towards the end of his speech about how these things usually play out. Have you guys seen a lynching video? Yeah. Mostly it has come to you not because somebody was trying to be a whistleblower. It must have been circulated because people were circulating it out of glee and joy and a sense of power, right? The scene usually plays out in terms of mass, tacit, or active participation in things. The last video that I saw was when the police was standing by. The mob had finished very casually, very, aram se, killing one man with stones and kicks, even in a very bored way, chanting Jai Shri Ram, like as if it was almost dispensable, but they had to do it anyway. The police waited, they took one body away, and the killing with stones and kicks of the other body resumed, and that is how much I could watch. Mohan Bhagwat says that this is not an Indian phenomena because there is not an Indian word for it. Social media jumped onto the bandwagon. They suggested, Hindi mein we can try, since Hindi has to now bear the burden of our dreams and aspirations, peet ke maar dalna. Okay, they suggested, and yet the National Crime Records Bureau, in its latest publication that it released, does not, in fact, and has not published the data on lynching. They say that the data from the states is unreliable. They, of course, have very up-to-date, very reliable data on anti-national crimes, anti-national elements, jihadi terrorist elements, And also, they seem to make the special distinction. So people from the northeast shall still be called insurgents, and people in Kashmir and elsewhere shall be called jihadis and terrorists. So they have data on that out on time, right? Now, I would submit that, this casual tolerance of structural and microviolence is historical, and it is the fertile ground upon which the violence today is not just accepted, it is celebrated. I do not believe that back in the day we were a tolerant, peaceful society, and only extreme events like the partition drove us to madness and we did what we did. I believe that we, or mainland India, has been and continues to be an astoundingly hierarchized and caste-divided society. That goes without saying, and both my panelists have spoken extensively about caste. The upper caste and upper castes, and right now, of course, the discourse is more complicated, to maintain their status quo, to resort to violence was the most natural thing to do, right? And our capacity for dehumanization can rival the best of racism, anti-Semitism, gay shaming, whatever it is, in Islamophobia in any part of the world. I do believe that civility, solidarity, empathy, all of these are, in as much as these were found in the past, but I do believe that these are fundamentally modern projects. They need progressive institution building, they need large-scale social churning, they need the organization of labor to become our defining qualities. So much has been spoken about how the management of economic crisis in India has brought us to where we are. So very quickly, I would just like to recap with a few points. For the spin that we are given that till 1991 we were a socialist economy and thereafter we liberalized is not true. We were an economy that tried to carry the risks for indigenous capital in the first few decades of our existence. Our economy under Indira Gandhi was some populist elements, though what this populism comprises can be debated, but there were some redistributive elements there. It was Rajiv Gandhi before 1991 who actually lays open the grounds for the penetration of free market / trade on the terms of the wealthy and the more able. We open up in 1991 during a situation where most of our population is in no way capable of taking advantages of the even short-term gains that accrue to societies when free markets initially happen, right? But the size of our population and the size of our emerging middle class was big enough to keep global capital sated for quite some time. I feel it's during the UPA 2 when the contradictions of managing the demands of late capitalism and also the demands of labor, they reach a point of serious negotiation, and that is when I think a lot of big capital decides that to bypass the concerns of labor, environment, and human development, as is the nature of big capital, they need to switch over almost completely to the BJP. To the BJP, NDA, backup, RSS. In the meantime, of course, what has happened among many other things, and my panelists have spoken about it, in very short, you have an emergent middle class, which is very small in number, but very small percentage-wise, but very big in size. You have the penetration of technologies that puts, the means of this whole idea of you have a cell phone in your hand, right? And you see people wearing things, eating things, doing things, and you cannot do it. This is what people, I think, call the frustration of rising ambitions. I was just recently reading our Nobel Prize Jholawala economist from JNU, Abhijit Banerjee, spoke about how, in one of his research, he said that how when the poor get money, they choose to spend it on luxury items. They choose to buy a television, or they choose to eat expensive food, and how his research and the research of a lot of people like him is geared towards teaching the poor how to invest wisely. I see in this not the fact that the poor lack judgment, but about the fact that consumerist ideology, which needs more televisions to sell and more food, expensive food to be eaten, it's managed to penetrate the priorities of the poor as well, right? So you see, I think that with the basic tenor of Indian economic policies designed to keep minimally decent standards of living out of the reach of the 90%, the frustration can burst forth in a myriad of expressions. A more careful analysis of it has been taken by the two of you, but if I were just to very polemically speak about, I mean, it goes either towards a leftward shift or a rightward shift. The politics of the left within a new liberal world economy promises greater distribution of resources. The right promises the steady creation and deliverance of straw men upon whom you can release your frustration. The RSS BJP, of course, has gone from a fringe phenomena, and when I say that the RSS BJP has been a fringe phenomena for many years, I by no means imply that right-wing tendencies were not prevalent in India, rather that right-wing tendencies were well absorbed and played in by the Congress. But now when they have gone from a right-wing phenomena to big capital's choice of instrument to keep extracting from Indian labor and Indian market, it has, of course, have had to prove that it has to be effective in channeling frustration into hatred. The long-cultivated ideology of Hindu majoritarian supremacy, it does pay lip service to a territorial idea of the Hindu citizen. So, Savarkar would have you believe that everyone who resides east of the Indus are Hindu. But of course, that is not how the spirit of the RSS plays out on the roads today. We have no dearth of directing popular anger against enemies of choice. Standing in the order of the firing line are Muslims, communists, Dalits, Naxalites, Christian, academics, intellectuals, historians, social workers, economists, and of course we should not forget women. The ideology of the RSS and the BJP, notwithstanding the representation that it gives to certain women within its ranks, is fundamentally anti-modern, anti-progressive. It's anti-women. And thus, by layers and layers of exclusion, we become a nation of Islamist terrorists, urban Naxals, anti-nationals, and we shall all sooner or later be parceled and dispatched to Pakistan, right? But where do we go from here? As so has pointed out, very difficult to theorize. Genocide is one option. I'll leave it to the question-answer rounds. I'll quickly shift to talking about something else. And here, if I might peg it on, so you were speaking about how a Dutch scholar says that what we had earlier was liberalism without substantive democracy, and right now we have democracy that is intrinsically illiberal, and this democracy, which is illiberal because of a variety of factors, lends itself to muscular majoritarianism. I was recently reading, of course I'm a little lazy that way, I've not read the whole book. I was reading about a book by somebody called Domenico Lasurdo, Liberalism, A Counter History. I mention it because you guys can take a look at it at some point. And the person does a very, very good job of what a lot of us have always felt. I mean, he just systematically picks up liberal theory, liberal philosophy, punctures all the holes of the universal standards made for all human beings within this whole plethora of liberalism, you know, right from John Locke to Mill to almost everyone. The rights of man were the rights of white men, right? Not women. When the rights of when the rights of black men came about in terms of voting, it was denied to women. This whole tendency of inclusion that liberalism promises actually brings with it a lot of, you know, you can get in, but not you. You know, you have to you have to match up to the standard of civilization. You have to be civilized. Right now, you are savages, barbarian, women, brown, black, what have you. Okay, because post-colonial, if I might say that, post-colonial countries like India have had to learn the ropes of this game when they were performing anti-colonialism and when they were performing coming up to a standard of civilization, when the whole move for decolonization was on. I would submit that nominally liberal state like India, okay, professing secularism, all the rest of it, knew how to play this game pretty well, and thus, like every other liberal state in the making, in the consolidation, India has its hands soaked in blood. Today, as we speak, there is the last meeting in a round of 180 meetings between R.N. Ravi, the interlocutor on behalf of the government of India for the Indo-Naga peace process, and the NSCN-IM, the prime insurgent group with which negotiations for the future of the Naga national question has been going on for the last 22 years. The longest standing series of negotiations. The last time something like this was attempted was between 60 and 64. That's how the state of Nagaland comes into place. The example of Nagaland, and here I am not advocating Naga independence. I think the Naga national process has some serious issues with identity politics, the use of religion and all of those things. But I'm using the Naga example to show how over the course of the last 70 years, the Indian state against its own people, to whom today it is denying the right to have a constitution, a flag, even though the Nagas say that our constitution will be undeniably bound to the Indian constitution. The Indian state has had no qualms in killing outright, using rape as a weapon of war, committing what the International Working Group of Indigenous Affairs says genocide in the Naga Hills between 1956 and 1964. They allege 1 lakh Nagas dead out of a very small population. Turning Nagas against each other, abetting fratricide. Finally, when they are unable to sort of change the status quo of one of the arms of the resistance movement, then they began to negotiate in 1997. Of course, the Indian state has been very pragmatic in allowing this particular armed group, NSCN-IM, to gradually consolidate the political and the civil society space and allow it to undertake consensus building within the Nagas. Okay? Right now, as we speak, our government has changed. The Naga national movement had believed that governments might come and go, but our peace talks will go on the way it has gone on. There will be a continuity, but post Article 370, that does not seem to be the case. Today, suddenly, the interlocutor has been saying that we shall not continue to negotiate endlessly under the shadow of guns. Notwithstanding how many guns the Nagas hold in Camp Hebron, the Indian army is firmly stationed with its guns, so the shadow of the guns are the ones of the Indian state. Within October 31st, some sort of a settlement or a lack of settlement will happen. But the Naga issue is basically one that I would use to illustrate the fact that in consolidating its statehood, whether it's Nagaland, Mizoram, endless, in Mizoram, carpet bombing by the Indian Air Force was used against your own people. Whether it's Hyderabad or whether it is the gradual lack of distinction between militancy and terrorism when it comes to Kashmir, or even as the previous army chief, the current army chief, Bipin Rawat, spoke about how in Kashmir, anybody who helps a militant / terrorist is a terrorist himself. So the almost seamless categorization of citizens of your country into bodies that are dispensable, I think, is very much a part of liberal discourse. So that's something that I would like you guys to think about a little bit and probably discuss, and leave it at that. Thank you.